Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and have looked forward to this. I had a chance through some contacts in Atlanta to get acquainted with some of the people at Cox Communications through their executive education program, which I know is the reason that I got invited to be here. They have an executive education program that they run through the Terry Business School at the University of Georgia. So I've been talking with them and thinking about the future of your industry, in addition to all the other industries that I get a chance to work with. I'm from Seattle, so it's a bit of a trip to get here, but I'm always delighted to come to Williamsburg. I've been here several times, and it's interesting to be in a place that celebrates the past so much. And I thought I might start with a story from the ancient past of television. I've been around a little while myself. In fact, I've been around so long that I can remember when my family got its first television. And it was a very momentous event. It wasn't there when I was an infant. I was probably 5 years old or so. And there's quite a little story about that, but not quite as good as the story of a woman who was a member of a company that I was working with. We were doing a strategic planning retreat. And this is absolutely a true story. And as you often do in those kinds of settings, you're telling some stories about yourself so you get better acquainted. And she said, I remember also when we bought our first television in the mid-1950s, so she's a little bit older. And she said it was one of those big console televisions, a few of you remember those. And she said our dad bought it, and he brought it in, and it was set down in the living room. And we had several brothers and sisters, she said. And he gathered us all around. And he showed us this new console television, and he said, now nobody is to touch this machine until I get home from work each day, because I will be the only one in the family allowed to start it up. And I've always liked that story, because this was a guy who obviously was kind of the first, from the first automobile generation, the first real machine generation when you think of it. Now looking at this newfangled electronic machine in his house. Of course, I presume they had a radio and a telephone and so on, but this new machine, and thinking of it in machine-like terms, not in new technology kind of terms. How much are we thinking of our own technology in ways that are in the process of becoming kind of obsolete? We're here at, let me see if I can get the show to play. Why is it not playing? Escape. There we go. We're here at your show. And it's tempting to try to solve problems in the way that we've always thought of them. Recently, I came across a really nice line from Peter Drucker. I don't know if you ever read Peter Drucker when he was writing, still in the late 90s especially. Virtually everything he wrote toward the end of his life was essentially his thoughts about how to look at the future. And I just came across this great line from him, which says, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It's to act with yesterday's logic. And knowing what the little bit that I know about your industry, I'm sure the challenge you're facing is, when are we, the difference between acting with yesterday's logic and tomorrow's logic, and somehow trying to figure out what the difference is. What would actually be a new kind of logic? In a sense, when you're asking that, you're asking the ultimate question about the future, which is, what is your image of the future? When you think of it, whether you're thinking 5 years ahead or even longer term, 5 or 10 or 15 or even further ahead than that, what kinds of images and pictures and words and so on pop into your mind? And why is that important? One of the most inspirational people that I know of, I've had a chance to meet him a couple of times, who is constantly thinking about images of the future, is this now relatively well-known industrialist named Elon Musk. And I thought I might begin challenging your own images of the future by sharing with you his. I'm often asked, how did you become a futurist? And my story is relatively long. I tell it in one of my books, but Basically, I'm at a college in Spokane, Washington as a student when the college hires as a new president a guy who comes to the college straight from industry, from a company at the time named Rockwell, where he was director of program planning for Apollo. And he stands up in front of his first college convocation and says, I'm a futurist. And from that point on, I think, well, that sounds like an interesting thing to want to be. And so I learned basically to think about the future, a certain process and a certain way of thinking about the future, from a guy who was literally involved in the space program. Many, many years later, a few years ago now, at a conference in California, I was in a room somewhat smaller than this with about 30 people with Elon Musk, the now famous industrialist, as you'll see in a video I'm about to play. And Elon explained very matter-of-factly how and why he was going to go to Mars by 2030. We've been to Mars on our screens through the machines that we've sent there. That's a picture of Mars on the screen right now. It looks a little bit like the American Southwest. But what would it be like to really be there? Well, Elon Musk might be the one who helps some human beings actually find that out. Here is Elon Musk with his images of the future.
My name is Elon Musk. I helped create PayPal and then Tesla.
NASA turns to the private sector to resupply the International Space Station.
I recently helped create SpaceX. The reason I got into space exploration was because it didn't seem to me that we've been making the progress that we should make, given the fact that we could get to the moon in 1969. In fact, it seemed like we were going backwards.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket.
I thought it was important that we ultimately be on a path towards creating self-sustaining civilization on Mars. And NASA awarded us one of 3 contracts to upgrade our capability to human transport.
What we're looking at here is a Dragon spacecraft pressure vessel.
And I like working on engineering and design. Sales and finance, not really my forte. We intend to keep advancing space technology until it's possible for people to go to Mars. If I live, say, another 20 years at least, I think it'll probably happen.
So that's incredibly exciting to me. I don't know about whether it's true for you. You know, there's a Dutch company that is running, it's probably going to be mostly just a reality TV show. This opportunity to sign up to take a one-way trip to Mars. Yeah, it's actually true. They claim that early in the 2020s they want to be able to have the rocket ship ready to put a half a dozen people on it and with enough life support to take them on a one-way trip to Mars and then keep resupplying them over time. And you right now still could go and sign up for that one-way trip to see if you'd get selected. How many people in the world do you suppose have signed up already? Yeah, it's many. The last time I saw it was over 600,000 people had volunteered to get on that ship to go on a one-way trip to Mars. And so that kind of thing always captures at least some people's imagination, right? Dreaming about the long-term future, the big picture future, the future that's really far out there. I'm sure that that's what you would like to do tomorrow or the day after tomorrow when you're back at your desk. But in your business, you're probably more likely to see this on your desk than the one-way ship to Mars. Now, this is from Forbes Online 2 weeks ago. Cable TV model, just not unpopular, not just unpopular, but unsustainable. And it goes on to explain a little bit about why the writer, in this case, thinks that it's true. Now, I actually think that the writer of this particular article in Forbes exaggerates. It certainly exaggerates the timeline. I suppose if you look at a very long-term future, that is a decade, 2 decades, one could make this argument. But if you look at the next year or 2 or 3, it's a little bit premature to be saying this. And yet at the same time, I know that this is sort of what the world looks like to you, at least based on those of you in the business that I've been talking to. Where should you go? What is the right focus for people in the industry that you've been in for these years? Should you be focused more on social media? Should you be focused more on just your local community? I was looking at some of the differences among the local communities and who serves them here in the state of Virginia, and noticing the differences in terms of subscriber levels and broadband penetration and so on, and noticing really quite a lot of opportunity community by community. And it might vary more between communities here than you might think, although I'm pretty sure that you probably know that. Should you be focused on mobile? Should you be focused on not the delivery of television, but the delivery of video, as I know that you are? Or is it all about a two-way video communication these days? I read that at any given time, about 25% of broadband traffic these days consists of video being sent up or downstream. And it turns out people want to consume lots and lots and lots of video, but they also like to produce it and send it up and send that around. And I just saw in a talk that I was watching yesterday as I was flying out here from Seattle, the BBC, at some times reports that half of their broadband traffic consists of users sending video back and forth. Is that really what the cables are going to be used for in the future? Just the sending of video, not the television signals that we think of, but other kinds of video? Or is the future all about the cloud? Or is it all about big data? Or is it about content? When would you have the scale? How much should you be involved in the producing of content? Will most content come from Amazon and Google and eventually Microsoft and Netflix? How much content will come from where, and who should own it, and who should send it around? And then, of course, there's the issue of over-the-top television, which you've been dealing with for half a dozen years or more, with the question being, will that generation of people for whom the television was always there, for whom the computer was always there, for whom the internet was always there, will they eventually really change this industry in ways that go beyond even the changes that we're thinking about? Are you in a world where some small changes will enable you to maintain your revenue streams? Or are you in a world where you really need to think of revolutionary kind of change? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's one clearly that you're wrestling with. How big, how much, how fast? Can you just put a few Band-Aids on the current cable model and then maintain it for another, let's say another 10 years? Or will it be so substantially different 10 years from now that it won't be too terribly recognizable? How many of you can remember, for example, when Apple introduced the iPod? Name a year. When was it? 2006? Not the iPad, not the iPhone, but the iPod, the thing that that started it all. They actually introduced it in 2001. Which surprised me when I looked that up, because it seems longer ago than that. It didn't really get much of a market take-up until 2004. So if you said 2006, you're close. It really didn't really become a big deal in the marketplace until 2004. So it's been 9 years for Apple. And Apple's been around for quite a long time. More than 50% of Apple's revenue now, of course, comes from iPhones and iPads. The iPod is basically done. But in 9 years, more than 50% of the revenue at Apple comes from something that didn't exist 9 years ago. If we looked at your industry, at your company 9 years from now, do you think it's safe to say that more than 50% of your revenue will come from something that doesn't exist right now? Well, I don't know that it'll be quite as dramatic as it is for Apple, or perhaps for Amazon with Kindle, or for IBM with the Watson computer, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the question is, can you stay static, put a Band-Aid here, a Band-Aid there, or will you be, and should you be, ambitious, or have ambitions to be substantially different by 5 years or 9 years from now? This is a challenge for planning, and I've been engaged in strategic and long-range planning with organizations for a very long time now, since I left my early career in higher education. And what I'd really discovered is that most organizations, when they sit down to do what we call strategic planning, essentially are trying to come up with more and more elaborate plans to create a more efficient past. Take the current model, make it cheaper, make it better, make it perhaps a little faster, make it a little bit more attractive, but essentially you're trying to create a more efficient and a more effective, perhaps a slightly more profitable past, rather than really searching for a new future. Now, we don't search for a new future because it's hard, it's challenging. We're not all geniuses, and the things don't pop into our heads. And they may not actually be there in the data. One of the big pitfalls that I've discovered as a futurist when I work with organizations on strategic and longer range planning is people think that if I just look at the future trends long enough, it will become obvious what I should do. And that's not necessarily the case. What might become obvious is a risk that you should try, an experiment that you might test out, but it's rare that the answer is staring you right in the face. You still have to somehow come up with your own hunch, your own idea, and then take a risk. In the end, the future creates the present. It's a really interesting and wonderful concept. I began by asking, what is your image of the future? And we can think of the future writ large, or we can think of the future of the industry or your company. Whatever that image is, it's exerting an influence over the choices that you're making today. I often tell a story. It's a really good story. It's actually now 20 years ago, Fortune magazine did a cover story, and on the cover were three kind of mechanical-looking dinosaurs, each of whom had names: IBM, Sears, General Motors. 3 dinosaurs. And the article was seriously asking in 1993, 20 years ago, whether these 3 companies, who had been named by Peter Drucker in 1963, 30 years before, as the best managed companies in the history of the world, in 1993, Fortune was asking, are these companies actually going to go extinct? Now, they each had a myriad of problems and challenges, but one of the things that happened to each of them is they each had an image of the future of retailing or of the computing business or the automobile business, and they focused on strategies that would make them successful in that image. And meanwhile, the world was going somewhere else, either before they noticed, or it's much more likely before they were taking seriously what they were noticing. That is, your organization, all organizations are full of people saying, hey, wait a minute, I think the world's going over here. And the response is, well, that might be true, but we're awfully busy right now. Or that might be true, but I'm retiring in 2 years. Well, I'm going to leave that up to you guys to deal with that. You know, and we have all those kinds of lines that we respond with. So it isn't that it's all that mysterious that the world is going somewhere else. It's just that it's kind of confusing, and we know how to do what we're doing, and so on. And so sometimes, actually fairly often, we wait too long. And then we're in this kind of scrambling and catch-up mode. Well, how do you try to match up your image of the future with what might actually be happening? Well, you start looking at future trends and future issues that are staring us right in the face. For example, the fact that we clearly live now in a full-on network society. Something like 7.5 billion cell phones exist in the world. 5 billion people have access to the broadband internet right now. 9 billion people have access through one means or another to social media, or soon 9 billion to social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be 100 billion machines in the Internet of Things sending signals back and forth. We live in this sort of full-on network society. When this industry began, when you stop to think about it, the ability to send data back and forth was a relatively scarce commodity. And so the industry grew up in a time where you were overcoming scarcity and providing something that literally people could not get almost any other way. Really, in many places, they could not get it in any other way. Now, of course, we live in this full-on network society, not news to anybody here. And so now you're an industry that lives in the middle of abundance rather than in the middle of scarcity. And the question is, does the model that you're working with account for the fact that you're living in the middle of abundance in terms of network signals and the data that's flowing over it? All kinds of things are going to become possible because we live in this full-on network society. I like to tell this story because it's such an inspirational story, and it's such a kind of a surprising one in terms of the potential that this industry is a part of. Let's suppose that everybody in the world could be on broadband. I mean, really high-speed broadband. Let's call it gigabit, or let's at least say 100 megabit kind of broadband. And that could eventually be available to almost anybody in the world wherever they are, which is, you know, a little bit far-fetched. It takes a lot more physical infrastructure build out and wireless infrastructure build out. But let's suppose that that becomes true over the next decade and a half or so, if the world economy will cooperate with us. What might start happening? Well, here's a wonderful story. Some of you might have heard it. It actually was on, I believe it was on Frontline not that long ago, but it made a splash early this year when this kid made a presentation to one of the TEDx conferences. His name is Jack Andraka, and it's just such a great story. Jack is a 16-year-old kid sitting in his high school biology class. He has two acquaintances or family members who have died of pancreatic cancer. If you've ever known anybody who's had that, and I have, it tends to be a very fast cancer in that because it's so deep in the body, doesn't give off a lot of signals. A doctor cannot feel it with physical manipulation. And so pancreatic cancer tends to get discovered relatively late when it's too severe to be treated. And so people who get it typically die within a few months. And this had happened to two acquaintances of Jack Andraka. So that's the background. He's sitting in this high school biology class. The teacher is giving a lecture or talking about antibodies and how they work, how they seek out things within the blood and so on. Meanwhile, Jack is illegally using his computer or his iPad or whatever he had and surfing the internet. They're not supposed to do that, but he's doing it in class, and he happens to be reading about carbon nanotubes. If you know anything about carbon nanotubes, it's that kind of nanotechnology that has the ability to conduct electricity. And somehow he gets this brainstorm, what if you could attach antibodies to carbon nanotubes and use that to detect cancer? So he writes up his little idea. He sends it off to 200 research institutions, universities, and so on. Of course, being a 16-year-old high school kid, 199 of them ignore him. But one researcher, I believe at Johns Hopkins, says, well, that's kind of intriguing. He gets a hold of Jack. And long story short, a project is developed. They take a substrate, they coat it with carbon nanotubes, which then if you hit it with electricity will have a certain kind of electricity profile, right? Then you attach an antibody which will discover mesothelin, which is an indicator of pancreatic cancer in the blood. You attach that to each of the carbon nanotubes, then you wash the substrate with blood, and then if that substance is there in the blood, that stuff will migrate to the antibodies and push the carbon nanotubes slightly apart, which changes the profile when you run electricity through it, and therefore is an indicator. And so Jack Andraka inspired a test now available, which is 168 times faster, 26,000 times less expensive, over 400 times more sensitive than the current standard, costs 3 cents per test and takes 5 minutes. That's an example of what becomes possible when you live in a full-on network society, where people all over the world have access to information that they just didn't have before, and the ability to put all these things together and then to communicate with people all over the world in a way that didn't exist. And really, in many ways, thanks to your industry, this is now possible. So what is driving the future? If you were asking, what is my future image, does it really match up? If I'm kind of have this hunch, or if I actually am convinced that by 5 years from now or 10 years from now, my business will not and should not look exactly the same, what are the future trends that I should be taking into account? Here are a few that I will click through, many of which are not new to you. They won't be all that different than things you've been reading and hearing, but let me highlight a few things from them. Demographic dynamics. An interesting one for you all is the sustainability imperative. Economic disparity, which has to do with the performance of the economy primarily. Technology acceleration, of course. Industry churn, and then transparency. Let's start with demographics. What's the most powerful demographic trend in the United States? Well, there's a debate, and there are 3 powerful demographic trends, none of which, again, are unknown to us, but all of which are probably underestimated by us in terms of their impact literally in the next decade or decade and a half. Let's begin with aging. Everybody in the room knows that we live in an aging society. We know that more and more people live to be 65. Ken Deitwald wrote his very famous book called The Age Wave about what would be happening to society when the baby boomers began to turn 65. He wrote that in 1990, a long time ago. But basically he said starting in 2011, the first baby boomers will begin to turn 65. Sure enough, it's 2 years later. And we're beginning to see that impact in the conversation that we're having about the future of retirement, for example. We know that historically, even when Williamsburg was founded, people lived to be 65, but they were very, very rare. Now it's common, and if you make 65, you're going to live on average in the US another 20 years, which means that the US Census Bureau forecasts that by 2025, we will have 27 Floridas in the United States. I notice Virginia is not one, but because of the younger age profile, particularly up in Northern Virginia, because of all the association with Washington, D.C., and the fact that that tends to have a fairly young crowd who works there. If you want to see the future, literally just wander down to Florida sometime and just kind of look around. And literally that's what you see, because in the average state in the United States today, about 12% of the population is over 65. A little bit lower here, a little bit lower in a few other states. But if you jump out to 2025, state after state after state, it's 20 to 25%. And this will be true in some of the towns that you serve. 20 to 25% of the population will be over 65. Literally, in your mind's eye, is an image of the future. Imagine walking down the street and 1 out of every 4 or 5 people you see is over the age of 65. And you're not visiting a retirement community, you're just at home. That's the world which is coming, and it's coming now very, very fast. It's going to have an impact on housing, an impact on transportation, an impact on employment. What is the impact on employment that it's already having? Well, we know that people have not saved enough for retirement, and we do not have the kind of retirement systems that we had in place just a few years ago. As a very small percentage of the future retirees have actually pensions as we used to think of them. They might have some 401k. What's the average savings in the average 401k of a person approaching 65? Does anybody know the answer to that? There's a little bit of dispute about it. The financial industry says it's about $100,000 in the average 401k balance of a person approaching retirement, which is not very much if you're going to expect it to last for 20 or 30 years. However, a study from a Princeton professor this fall, it was highlighted in Forbes, says, well, that's not the real number. The real number is more like $35,000 in the average 401k balance, because people have taken so much out to pay off bills and so on. And it turns out that we could be, according to Forbes and Wall Street Journal and some others, facing a literal kind of retirement catastrophe over the next 20 years, because the baby boomers are not going to be as well off as everybody assumed that they would be. And what does that mean? That means people want to stay in the workforce longer. Because they have to, because they want to, and so you see an increasing number of people who are approaching what formerly was a retirement age saying, you know, I think I'll do this for a couple more years, 3 or 4 more years, and that's going to have a major impact. So that's an interesting one. The other thing to know about this group, when you think about them as your customers going ahead, is that you have to not think about today's 65 years old or yesterday's 65-year-old, but tomorrow's 65-year-old who will be technology savvy, computer savvy, Facebook savvy, social media savvy, and all of that kind of stuff that we think of that as being the stuff that the kids are good at. But of course, the 50-year-olds are good at that now. And the 60-year-olds are good at that now. And so that's the future 65-year-old customer. It isn't the elderly customer of today that we're really talking about. That's number one trend. Number two trend is the increasing diversity in the US population. Something which still is not as reflected in how we think of the future customers as perhaps it should be. Following the 2012 election, the Pew Foundation, fascinated by the fact that the Latino population went so heavily Democratic, produced a quick study on the future of the Latino or Hispanic population. And this is what they found. This was published in December of last year. Median age of the native-born Latino in the US is 18. The median age for all Latinos is 27 versus 42 for non-Hispanic whites in the US. 67,000 US Latinos turn 18 each month, 93% of whom are already citizens. And that means that from now to 2030, 40% of US population growth will be Hispanic, and 77% of US population growth will consist of all of the groups that we have traditionally labeled as minorities. And so if you look at the future workforce, not to mention the future customer set, over the next 25 years, increasingly it starts to look like these kids, and not the way we think of the population in the US looking. And so when I'm in boardrooms in particular, or in management suites, I like to encourage people to look around the room and ask, so when will the boardroom and the management suite start to look like this in the organizations that we're a part of? And inevitably, that will begin to happen as the customers begin to look like that and the workforce begins to look like that. But we tend to underestimate. We know that we're getting more diverse, but we really don't realize, unless you're in certain communities, how significant it is when the Census Bureau says that we flip in about the year 2040 to a majority of the US population consisting of groups that historically have been labeled as minorities. And that's a very, very powerful trend. The final trend is the emergence of the millennial generation, the kids that you see on the screen. Now, depending on when you want to say they were born, let's say 1980 to 2000, that kind of 20-year period. Some people started a couple years earlier or ended a couple years later. But that means the workforce walking in the door now is essentially all millennials. The millennial generation workers are now 18 to 31 years old if you started in 1980 or 82. And of course, the youngest of the millennials are 13. How many millennials do we have in the room born between 1980 and the year 2000? I suspect we have several. Oh, yeah, he made a mistake, not quite. But we have several. Well, the thing to know about the millennials as future customers, and especially as the future workforce, is they're very comfortable with diversity because they've been growing up in this world. They're comfortable with globalization and used to it. They're comfortable with 24/7 connectivity and rapid change. I came across this number this week. Right now, there's about 1 million foreign college students studying in the US, especially from China and the Middle East and some other places. Each year, somewhere between 250 and 500,000 US college students go overseas to study. They tend not to stay overseas as long as those who come here. They tend to go more for a semester or for a quarter. But this sort of global interchange of young people dwarfs anything that existed before. And so they are increasingly comfortable with that and sort of consider themselves as part of the larger world. Interestingly, a recent study among millennials said that 50% would rather have no job than hate their job. And I know then they can do all the jokes, yeah, they'd rather live in my basement, but, and there is a little bit of truth to that, but it's a very interesting kind of flip, and people are asking, might this be a long-lasting kind of values change about how we think about work and the purpose of work and the value of work and so on. They expect fast advancement, they have high expectations, they want variety at work, and of course, obviously, they're very skilled in information seeking. If you look at what they really grew up with, take a millennial generation kid who was born in 1991, so sort of in the middle of the millennial generation. And they are now born in 1991, they're 22 years old, they're walking in the door, they've got a college degree. Well, they were 10 years old. The PC was 10 years old when they were born. The World Wide Web started when they were 2, and then there was Google, Napster, blogs, the first iPod, Facebook, YouTube, and then Twitter and 3D communication and so on. And therefore, they are the first digital native generation, a term that I'm sure you've probably heard by now. It was originated by a guy named Mark Prensky. So we have a few digital natives in the room who grew up in this world, and everybody else in the room is a digital immigrant, right? If you want to know the difference, all you have to do is watch this little video, which you have to read because it has subtitles.
Broder Ansgar? Ja, her er jeg. Ja, så bra, ok. Ja, hei du. Hei du. Ja. Ja, hva gjelder det? Ja, der er det her. Ja, vil du sitte? Takk. Ja. Jaha. Ja, så jeg har ikke fått gjort noen ting hele formiddagen. Nei, jeg beklager at det tar tid. Altså, skjønner vi holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha hjelp på en gang. Ja. Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller? Nei, den bare ligger der. Ok, har du forsøkt å åpne den? Ja, åpne den? Altså, hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helpdesk, hadde jeg vel? Nei. Vil du ha lyst på en vann? Nei, det skal være fort gjort, det skal vi se. Du bare gjør der. Sånn. Ja, da er vi i gang. Ja, altså så langt kom jeg også. Ok. Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne, så jeg turte ikke å gå videre. Åja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner at inni her, så ligger det kanskje flere 100 sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre, så tar du tak i et ark på den måten her, og så liksom blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der. Jeg blar, altså? Du blar, ja. Men når jeg skal tilbake da? Ja, da bare blar du tilbake igjen. Tar tak der, og så gjør du sånn. Der. Så er vi tilbake til den teksten du hadde, sa. Ikke noe... Ok, så den slutter der, og så fortsetter den der, ja. Ok, men når jeg skal avslutte for dagen, hva gjør jeg da? Da bare slår du sammen permene. Ja? På den måten der. Sånn. Da er den lukket her, ligger alt lagret inni der. Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå. Nei, alt ligger lagret inni her nå. Ja. I tilfelle du setter fyr på hele greia, det er kanskje lite sannsynlig. Ja, ok. Nei, for det er noe med det at når du har holdt på med skriftruller, så tar det litt tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja. Ja, det er av og til litt. Det er greit? Ja, men det er før det går. Jeg bare gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner... Sånn, og så, hva du kalte det? Blar. Jeg blar. Ja, blar i det. Blar frem og tilbake. Ja, og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Flott. Kjempefint. Ja, men du, nei, ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpnet den. Det er fra feil side. Du må åpne fra andre siden. Så det er ikke likegyldig, det altså? Du må åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der. Der er den åpnet. Ja vel.
So a lot of us in here are digital immigrants still, and the key thing is 2 points. Number one, when we think about the future of the use of the technologies that we're part of, it's helpful to try to not think about ourselves as digital immigrants and truly think about digital natives and how they use it and how they will use it. You have to realize, you know, the next generation is now 13 years old. The millennial generation came to an end, let's say, about 2000. So the ones who are really growing up in the social media world and the YouTube world and the, you know, everything being available, every movie you've ever, you know, every movie ever made, every television show ever made, every song ever sung, available through some means, and that's only in this last decade, and that's the kids who are growing up now. And so they will even more so than the millennial generation be people of the screen who will not accept old limitations about how we're supposed to be able to access information. And they are the ones, of course, that we think and have been thinking for quite a long time will drive more and more use of over-the-top kinds of services. One of the things that you see from the millennial generation in a study that was done by Cornerstone On Demand, this applies to those of you who are interested in your institutions as workplaces. They did a survey of American employees in August of this year. One of the things they found is that 56% of millennials and 39% of all employees use their own devices at work. Yesterday I was on the plane, I was flying next to a guy who works for one of the big customer service companies. He runs the customer service center. He was just about to go off to the Philippines to look at the status of their customer service call centers in the Philippines. And I noticed he had his company phone and he had his personal phone, and he was going back and forth between the two. 56% of millennials use this, and the study goes on to say, if they could, this is all they'd like to use. They would like to bring their own device to work and make that the work device. Only 43% of American companies actually have a policy over what you can do and can't do with your own devices at work. But the interesting thing, I was a few weeks ago shooting a little video with the in-house futurist from Cisco and a futurist from upstate New York whose name is Stowe Boyd, and this is Stowe Boyd's point. I've got to give him credit for it because it's so brilliant. And we're talking about bring your own device and what that means for the future of technology companies. And he said, well, you know, if you think about this thing that we all carry around, eventually we might be wearing, the first wearables are out. Eventually, I suppose, one could even imagine them being implanted, but certainly we're wearing them, whether it's Google Glass or whether it's a watch, and we're certainly carrying them. He said it's not just a communication tool. It is an extension of who we are. Whenever we have a question, we consult this device, or this device works on our behalf. It has become an extension of the way we think. In a certain sense, he said, it's actually become an extension of our brain, an amplification of our brain. So he said, when a young employee walks in the door and says, I'd like to use my own phone, what they're really saying, Stowe Boyd said, is, I'd like to bring my own brain to work. Because the way I have it set up and the way I work with it is an extension of how I think. And it really is, I thought, a very powerful concept. Now let me mention a couple of the other trends just briefly. So the sustainability imperative is an interesting one for cable companies. We know that the planet is changing in terms of weather. We know that there's a canary in the coal mine up north, it's called the North Pole, and that the ice, which melts every summer and refreezes every winter, is gradually getting less and less in volume. In fact, there's 76% less ice at the end of the summer now than there was in the late 1970s. And this is a chart that will play us from 1980 out to the year 2012, when we hit the minimum amount of ice ever measured, since they've been measuring it at that time. But what it means is that the likelihood of variable weather and an interest in more and more resilience and an interest in security on the part of cities and communities and homeowners will increase. One of the business areas that I know many of you look at is the home security market. As weather gets wilder and people feel less secure because of the changing climate in which we live, I think we're going to see a growth in interest in the home security business, even though it's only indirectly related to weather. It's just this sense that things are kind of crazy because, in fact, things are kind of crazy. And so we'll see an increased interest in security and resilience. One of the answers, of course, to the issue of sustainability is to begin thinking differently about basically our energy mix. If you let that drop, which looks like a drop of oil, on the screen represent all the fossil fuels that we burn in a given day in the world, coal, oil, gas, natural gas liquids, and so on. It's fascinating to note that 9 seconds of sunlight is the equivalent of all of that fossil fuel that we dig up and light on fire. Which makes me assume, as a futurist, that at some point in the future, probably sooner than everybody in the room thinks, we will be shifting to a much more solar-based economy. And it might be a 20-year process or a 30-year process or a 40-year process, but I think that's where we're headed, which then takes us to this amazing guy in northern Idaho with his vision of the future of electricity and cable TV as he works on the prototypes of the very first solar roadways.
In December of 2007, a ton of liquid asphalt was $175. We're getting quotes at over $1,000 a ton now. Asphalt has gone up so much because it's petroleum-based. I don't believe we're going to have the ability to build asphalt roads in 50 years. What we're proposing is a road that pays for itself over its lifespan. Not only pay for itself, but provide a whole slew of new features. Welcome to Solar Roadways. There's 25,000 square miles of road surfaces, parking lots, and driveways in the lower 48 states. If we covered that with solar panels, just a 15% efficiency, we'd produce 3 times more electricity than this country uses on an annual basis. And that's almost enough to power the entire world. Roads are collecting heat anyways. This thing collects the power and stores it. Your whole road is an electric grid. It delivers the power right to your front door, along with cable TV, high-speed internet access, your telephone, everything right there. The technology behind it has already been done to death. I'm just taking a lot of different technologies, making something new out of it. The one thing that hasn't been done is driving on glass. It's got to have the same traction as asphalt, has to be strong enough to support a fully loaded semi-truck, locking them up at 80 miles an hour, shatterproof, fireproof, transparent enough to allow the sunlight through but not to allow the glare back into the driver's eyes, all these specs.
The idea of making a road out of glass is really out-of-the-box thinking, because most people, when you mention the word glass, all they can think about is its fragility and ability to fracture. In fact, glass can have as high a strength as steel. We know how to manufacture glass. We know what photovoltaics are. We know what we have to do to protect glass from damage. We know what it takes to lower manufacturing costs. The research that's really needed has more to do with adapting glass for this particular application.
I just thought you'd find that really, really intriguing. The guy's actually working on a couple of DOT grants when they put out a solicitation to build an intelligent road that could pay for itself. They're building the prototypes and imagining, beginning with parking lots and sidewalks, becoming solar collectors, and then eventually perhaps some roads as well. The idea of it being the place that the vehicle for delivering cable TV and electricity, that might be a little bit more far-fetched, but it's kind of interesting. Let's take a look at the economy, just real quickly. A couple of things to understand about the economy. Number one, the economy is in the process of shifting from a job-based world to a stint-based work world. This is another one that Peter Drucker foresaw in the 1990s. What is a stint-based work world? A stint-based work world is a world in which classic jobs, defined as going to work for an organization and staying there for a very long period of time, perhaps for an entire career, and getting wages and benefits in exchange for your work, is gradually going away. Peter Drucker said by 2020, more than half the US workforce would be engaged in stint-based work. What's a stint? You go to work for Cox and you're on an 18-month project to develop some prototype, and when the project is over, the stint is over. Now you might get hired in to work on another project, or you might get transitioned into a regular job, or you might not. And then you go off and you form a little consulting company, you do that for a couple of years, and then you find out that doesn't really work, and then you go to work for a small startup that's doing some social media startup, and you do that for a couple of years, and then it's bought by a bigger company. You decide you don't want to work for a bigger company, so you go take another stint, and that's a stint-based work world, which is true of the world of work that we're moving into. The other thing that's happening in the world of work is this disassociation from increases in productivity from wage growth. This is the classic American story of the last couple of decades, as the middle class income has gone relatively flat, but productivity has continued to go up. And the challenge of getting those two lines to come back together is the great economic challenge of our time. If we don't actually address and begin to solve this challenge, when you look out 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, it's difficult to see a large middle class with lots and lots of disposable income. Instead, what you see is a very large group of people with very little disposable income just struggling to get by. And that means that both people and organizations are constantly searching for something better. Organizations are constantly searching for the next stint worker, and people in organizations are constantly searching for the next good job. Then there is the trend of technology acceleration, the one that you would expect the futurists to talk about the most. We know that technology in all kinds of realms continues to accelerate. And when you look ahead, it's very easy to see more augmented reality, or more intelligent computers, or even three-dimensional communication becoming more and more common, maybe through a glass like the Google Glass, or maybe through some kind of simulated holographic projection, or whatever. And we know about advances in nano and bio and information technology and cognitive sciences and robotics. What we may not really grasp yet is how fast really smart is coming. I did make sure that I watched Watson when it was on Jeopardy. It's now 2 years ago when it made its debut on Jeopardy. I don't know if any of you watched that. Did you know that when Watson was on Jeopardy, it had access to real time to 2 million pages of content? So when Alex put a question to the panel, Watson had 2 million pages of content that it could go through like that and come up with the association, and then come up with the likelihood of its answer being right. And if the likelihood met the thresholds which was expected of it, it would say what the answer was, and we all know from that story how well it did. Well, Watson is now being applied to medical research, it's being applied to financial analysis, and it's just now in the process, IBM is moving Watson into customer service. And in customer service, it will be able to anticipate what people want. Anticipatory computing, anticipatory thinking. If you think about how we search for things now, how we treat information out there, we still are pretty much a hunting and gathering kind of society. We have a question, one of your customers has a question, and it's kind of up to them to hunt and gather for the answer. And they might go online, they might come to you, they might look at different kinds of discussion boards and so on. But what if, through intelligence like Watson, the answer comes to them before they even know that they have the question in their mind? That's where we're headed with intelligence like Watson. And then there is the Internet of Things. Michio Kaku, the physicist who popularizes thinking about physics, wrote this for the year 2001, so we are halfway there. And this is what he said in 2001, looking ahead to the year 2020, now only 7 years away. In the next 20 years, PCs will be replaced by millions of tiny intelligent systems embedded in closed jewelry cars, furniture, and walls. They'll recognize voice commands, carry out simple wishes. They'll cost less than a penny, less than a scrap of paper. So companies that don't put chips or intelligence into all their products will be at a severe disadvantage. You've been madly putting chips and intelligence into your products and services for the last 10 years, and now we are about to see. We're still in the beginning stages of learning what it really means in terms of the kind of services that we can provide. When you look at technology, we're always looking for game changers like 3D printers, or for game changers in services like quantified health, which I think will become a bigger and bigger data kind of service. I'm wearing on my wrist it's a jawbone thing that measures my steps and measures my sleep and so on. I've been at management retreats. There's somebody tapping his. I've been at management retreats with companies in which we get to the first break and everybody in the room, this happened this summer, jumped up and ran outside and began walking up and down as fast as they could. And I discovered the entire management team had a device like this, and they were having a contest to see who could come up with the most steps each month, which is, fun. It's gamification of the place, but it also helps the bottom line in terms of less healthcare spending. That's a kind of service which is clearly going to be coming. We're at the end of mass-advertising. Not a new concept to anybody in this room. We know that there are all these billions of dollars that are spent on advertising. Increasingly, it's spent in the digital world, but not as fast to take up as we think. But as I mentioned, we're coming to the end of the hunting and gathering form of searching for information, and we're coming to the end of mass advertising. And where we're really headed is shifting from advertising to providing content in context. Now, there's a futurist in Southern California. She actually works for SWIFT, that international electronic exchange, financial exchange company, and she makes what are called these little future design videos for them. And this is one of them that she produced for the SWIFT company. But it really is a wonderful illustration of what it means to say we're in the process of switching from advertising to providing content in context when that content is needed. Watch this little video.
Mom, your garden looks great.
Oh, thanks, sweetie. This one is really special.
Is that sage?
It's from Grandma's new house. She's growing them everywhere.
It's amazing. Hey, we should send her some flowers for her new place.
Great idea. I'll go call a florist.
One sec, Mom, I have a better idea.
Okay.
Activate sync bed. Request florist delivery. 92056.
What was that?
I just put in a request for a florist so we can wait here while they come to us.
But you didn't talk to anyone.
It's a request that's already being cataloged. So businesses can bid on the service, message me, even offer coupons, see?
Do they know who you are?
No, I could be a dog for all they know.
A dog?
It's just a general request. It's non-binding, so I can even change my mind if we decide to send Grandma chocolates instead.
So now we just wait?
Yep.
For how long?
Depends. Could be a few minutes, could be a couple hours. What do you say we grab lunch and check in afterwards?
Lead the way, sweetie.
So, you ready to see our flower bids?
Yeah, how does that work?
Share bids with Mom's email. Now go ahead and check your email.
I like it. There it is.
12 bids. Not bad.
Oh, look at this one. I know this store.
My Secret Garden.
Yeah.
Let's check his inventory. Ooh. Wow, looks great. Mm-hmm. They have good reviews, too. Shall we?
Allow me. We'd like to buy the yellow tulip bouquet, please.
Accept bid.
That's how it works.
Done.
Great.
All set?
Oh, Grandma's gonna love these.
Flower delivery. Could you please sign?
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wait, who are they from?
Here's a card.
Hi, Grandma. Hi, Mom. We hope you like the flowers. It's all Jennifer's idea. Call me to let me know you got them, okay? Mom, she got them, I promise. Right. We love you.
So to do that, you've got to live in this very rich data world where content is delivered in context. And you know, it's kind of a fun little video, but how close to that are we? We're very close to that being the real world when we live in a world where data is clearly the new oil, the most valuable thing of all. Gary King, director of Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science, said this last summer. It's a revolution. We're just getting underway, but the march of quantification or big data made possible by the enormous new sources of data will sweep through academia, business, and government. There's no area that's going to be left untouched. People already buy differently, and they're in the process of doing that even more. One of the things that they might be doing is using alternative kinds of currencies. This is the world's very first Bitcoin ATM. It went live 2 weeks ago in Vancouver, BC. And it was actually our son who took the picture for an article in Wired. He's a news photographer, photojournalist. And so he ran up to, Wired called him and said, get up to Vancouver, BC, we're in Seattle, because the first ATM is going live. Now, it went live in Canada because their regulations are a little bit less stringent than here in the States. But you can go to the Bitcoin machine with your online Bitcoin credit, and you can put Bitcoin credit in and get up to 3,000 Canadian dollars out, or you can put up to 3,000 Canadian dollars in and get Bitcoin credit out. And you have to use a palm print for identification. That's a way to try to keep the machine from being used for money laundering, for international drug deals. But it's an indicator that alternative kind of currencies, what we think of as kind of these silly kind of internet currencies, might actually become real. I'm going to go past this one. To get here, in a world of big data, what is going to work? Now, the world that we're looking at, that world of the little selling of the flowers, that depends, and a world beyond mass advertising depends on millions of people essentially saying, I give you permission to not only store my data, but to track my behavior. We're all familiar with Snowden and NSA and the concerns these days, which I think are going to increase for a little while about privacy and about who has access to data and who should have access. What we can't have is a world in which our millions of customers all simultaneously say, I do not give you permission to track me. I withdraw permission for you to store my data. Because then $1 trillion goes up in smoke in terms of the business models that the whole data-based world is depending on. What's the answer? The answer is probably transparency. The answer is probably coming up with a means by which any customer at any time could come into your system and look on a page or 10 pages at precisely every piece of data you have about them. And perhaps selectively go in and say, delete this, delete this, delete this, delete this, leave the rest. That's the level of transparency that might be the thing that will save a data-based financial transaction world. So what is your image of the future? That's the question that I started with. I want to leave you with this concept. Some years ago, a Japanese writer described the economy which was coming, which we now fully live in. He called it a knowledge value economy. It's clear that we live in a world now that your product and your service depends more than ever on its knowledge value. When you no longer are selling a commodity in a scarcity-based world, but are selling a service and some physical things in a world of abundance, then your ability to succeed depends on your customers perceiving value there and not the only choice. And they perceive value if they think what you're offering them is smarter than what they can get somewhere else. When they look at your device or your service, do they say, that was built by smarter people than that stuff over there. Using this service is going to make me smarter. It's going to make it easier for me. I'll be working with smarter people who treat me as an intelligent person, and so on. All of that adds up to knowledge value. In the end, the challenge for you is figuring out, among all those choices that you have, where do you want to go? The answer is probably not out there waiting for you. The answer is inside your company and inside your own decision-making processes. because the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. And the question is, what is it that you want to do? Thank you very much for having me here. I think we have some time for questions. Thank you. By my clock, we have almost 10 minutes for questions. If I'm brief, I can probably cover 4 or 5, and I'd be happy to take anything.
So thanks for being here. I'm Catherine. I was actually in your executive development class.
I knew I recognized you. Yes, yes.
And Sharon's here too. And so we're so happy to see
Yeah.
you again. You did a phenomenal job again. You talked in our class in Atlanta a little bit about what executives need to be doing about future thinking and building that into their daily routine. So I was hoping you could share just really high level.
I will, yeah. Yeah. Because that was an executive training session, we were focused a little bit more on that. But there are 2 writers who became famous for writing about corporate strategy. There are several, and I'm not talking about Clayton Christensen, who's probably the most famous at all. Their names were Gary Hamel and C.K. Prochlad. I don't know if you remember their names. They were at Harvard at the time they were writing together. One of them has since died, and one of them has gone off to Michigan State, I think. They were the ones who, for example, invented the concept of the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG. And in the 90s, they were writing a lot about company vision and the concept called strategic intent. This is what they said, and it really rings true. They said, a question for an executive is, how much time should I spend in strategic, longer than average range thinking? Thinking beyond next week, next month, next year. How much of my time should be devoted to that? In America, the tradition is, a little bit of time, maybe an annual company strategic planning retreat and a few additional follow-up meetings, and then pretty much it's managing the day-to-day work and trying to hit the numbers and so on, right? That's how we work. Their argument was, crazily, that if you're in the senior management of a significant company, you should spend about 20% of your time looking at the long range, and which they defined as looking beyond 5 years and asking, what are the technological opportunities? What are the technological challenges? What are the competitive challenges? What are the new competitors that might be appearing? What are the old competitors going to be doing? What are the customers going to be like, and what are they going to be wanting, and what are they going to be wanting to let go of, et cetera, et cetera. All the kind of strategic longer range questions you would ask if you were looking beyond the normal horizon. And they said, you should devote 20% of your time to doing that. Now think about that. That's literally 1 day a week. And the bottom line story is, we were doing some strategic planning for the county library system in King County, which is the county in which Seattle is. And we were doing one session in which we had the library project person from Microsoft and the one from Google, and we had some architects and so on. And I mentioned that story, and the Microsoft person, not the Google person interestingly, but the Microsoft person said, well, that's interesting because senior management at Microsoft spends, I would say, at least 20% of their time trying to deal with that long-range view. Bottom line for me is we probably don't spend enough time trying to create an excuse to sort of let go of today's assumptions and discover what tomorrow's assumptions might be, kind of asking the 3 classic questions about the future. What's probable, what's possible, and what's preferred, and what does it really mean for us? When I put that early slide up of all the people walking on all those different stairs, to me that's it, sort of really getting in there and playing around with it. That's the challenge, but it's a really great opportunity. Organizations are full of people, including people in this room, who would love to devote a little bit of time to thinking longer range. We just constantly don't let ourselves do it because the day-to-day pressures are so great. But thank you for that question. What's another question that you have?
I have one. I'm struck by your last comment about the future is not what happens to it.
Something that we do. Mm-hmm.
And I look at those 2 demographic trends that you talked about. One, the aging, the brain of our society, and the other, the browning, if you will, of our society. And generally I'm an optimist, but when I see those 2 trends, and I see the gap that we see academically with people of color, which
Yeah.
And I see the jobs that are going to be maintained by this aging population, which may stay in the workplace longer. Where's the good news in all of this?
Yeah, where's the good? Yeah, so the question is, if you look at the aging population and the growth of the minority population, and we know what happens in the education system vis-a-vis the traditional minority population especially. And we know that gap gets worse with the charter school movement and so on. Those tend to cause that situation to become even a little bit worse. You can find lots of evidence for that. Here's the bottom line for me is these issues will probably not take care of themselves by themselves. That's why I say the future is something that we do. We think of it as something that we just wait for and then we'll deal with it when it gets here. But you know, educating the workforce up, dealing with a retirement challenge. For example, just now, we're beginning to see some conversation in the midst of all the deficit conversation. We're beginning to see the conversation on Social Security be about what can we do to increase Social Security benefits? Because if you've shifted to a 401k retirement system and it's not going to work, which is not, then you've got to do something with the only stable retirement benefit that we've got, which is Social Security. And there are actually some pretty easy answers on that if we wanted to step up and sort of bite the bullet and take it on. The education one is a harder one because I don't know that the education industry and then business itself is really looking 10 years ahead and asking, when the population has changed in terms of diversity, as the numbers all quite clearly say it's going to, are we proactively trying to organize ourselves and influence the system so that we have a highly effective workforce? This room, for example, reflects, you know, in 2025, this room or 2030 looks like the population. What would we do as businesses, as industries, besides just waiting for it to happen? What would we do in order to make sure that it happens in a very positive and proactive way? All of that is stuff that has to be stepped up to. You know, every now and then you see a little positive sign that people are paying attention to it, but you're right. Both of those are kind of backburnered as issues, as though they will just take care of themselves, and they probably won't. So we've got there's a lot of work to do.
Sometimes the way we look at the future is based on our own upbringing, our life history. How are you as a futurist, what are you doing to talk to younger people, those in the 18 to 25 age range, to see how they look at the future?
Well, the book that's on the screen that we just put, it's a Kindle ebook. And I just wrote with Dennis Walsh, who's a Canadian kind of environmental futurist. We met at a conference. We said, let's write a book. Let's write about the future of the city. We wrote the first chapter and we said, it's kind of boring to write another book about the future of the city. Let's write a book to millennials based on this thesis. The world population is moving to cities. The success of the future civilization depends on the success of cities. Kids are moving to cities. So kids, it's up to you to make cities what they need to be if we're going to have a successful civilization. So that's kind of what the book is about. So we're trying to speak directly to them. Interestingly, we just did some analysis at futurist.com. Futurist.com isn't a hugely popular site in terms of mass amounts of traffic. We get maybe 15 to 25,000 people a month who come to the website. But what's interesting about it is two things. Number one, they come from 120 different countries every month. So just the word futurist sort of captures attention. Number two, about 70% are between the ages of 18 and 30. So the generation that we call the millennial generation has an intense interest in the future. So speaking to them is a really smart thing to do. So we're actually in the process of some business planning ourselves to figure out how to do that even more effectively. But talking to them about the responsibility that they're going to take on for shaping the future in the midst of lots of crises. One of the things I get asked is, are you an optimist or a pessimist? It depends on the day, depends on the issue, but you can remain somewhat optimistic if you remember that human beings historically, at least for the last 10,000 years, have shown a pretty astonishing ability to step up when they don't have any other choice. We do, you know, it's not to say we won't make mistakes and don't make mistakes all the time, but when when change becomes kind of inevitable, we have this apparent ability to step up and say, okay, let's get busy and do something. So that's good. But it's a really good question. Talking to the millennials is a good thing. Maybe one more, and then I don't want to make you late to your break. So one last question. Yes, sir.
You kind of talked about the job-based work world and the STEM-based work
Yeah.
world. Do you see that more aligned in different careers or different job functions in the future, or do you see it just across the board?
You know, strangely, I do see it more across the board than you might think. But obviously, it's easier to do a stint-based thing in some kind of intellectual work, some kind of management work, some kind of finance work. But even so, you kind of separate sort of pure customer service. But all that might really bounce from stint to stint as well. The only one that you can really separate out would be some kinds of craft. And a little bit more skilled manufacturing that cannot be done by robots. But it's, job by job by job. It's possible to imagine shorter lifespans for the job, for the task, and then needing to move on. Futurists, when I started studying as a futurist decades ago, 2.5 decades ago, everybody was saying, well, you're going to have 7 careers. Or 7, they would actually say 7 careers in your lifetime, but then you'd really discover what they're really saying is 7 jobs. Well, it's really coming true. It's particularly, again, for somebody younger than a baby boomer who hasn't been in a career for a long period of time. It's really very likely that you'll have gone through a half a dozen or a dozen different jobs by the time you finish your work life. And that clearly is kind of a stint-based thing, which then demands changes in thinking about benefit packages and how they follow you around and retirement savings. The whole kind of thing that's called work needs to be reinvented. But job after job, for sure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Glenn, thank you for very thought-provoking comments, and very kind of freaking me out a little bit. But thank you. But I'm also very excited that it's our industry that's at the core of this. So we should all be very encouraged by that. Thank you to Christian and Barton for sponsoring the session. We'll now have a brief break. We'll be back here at 10:45. Thank you.